And for our listeners, I think it's about understanding glycogen reserves and glycogen stores in a horse and how fat helps delay the access to this.
What fuels aerobic energy, what fuels anaerobic energy. We can go briefly into the muscle fibers. Obviously, if you've got an endurance horse.
Welcome everyone to episode 141 of the CEN Nutrition Podcast with your host Bryan and Peter today. And today's episode is titled Using Fat to Increase Performance. How are you, Peter?
Bryan, very wet, and it's a little bit cooler as well. So the cold weather is coming.
The seasons have changed definitely, and that hasn't stopped the busyness that we've had in CEN, particularly with a lot of the high performance trainers, as Peter and I also prepare to go to Tom Quilty to cheer on all the competitors down there.
Absolutely, and also just a keynote to the grain-free, our first container has arrived into New Zealand over at Feed Central there. So any listeners, obviously, to this podcast from New Zealand, which we know by our data, there are a few. Obviously, we've got the grain-free there, the oil, we've got the CF50 as well at Feed Central in Cambridge.
It's a good quick plug too, Pete, because as we expand on this topic, and it is feeding that fat or feeding fat to help improve performance, the two sides to this is it's all about that sparing the glycogen to give that advantage and what fat does for that. And for our listeners, I think it's about understanding glycogen reserves and glycogen stores in a horse and how fat helps delay the access to this so you don't need as much in the horse.
Yeah, and also too, we've had a few diets this week where a few of the customers weren't sure whether fat puts weight on horses, whether it loses weight. And just to clarify, horses get fat from sugar; they don't get fat off fat. So they actually burn the fat as energy first, as we'll get into this topic, sparing the glycogen stores, and then obviously that glycogen which is stored, that explosive energy can be used when it's needed.
Yeah, these energy systems for a horse owner is not just for the high performance like the endurance and racehorses. It also comes down to dressage as well as other disciplines like in eventing, because they're all using their muscle fibers at different times of the event and helping utilize that aerobic and anaerobic, which we'll go into, will really give our horse owners a nice advantage going in to that event and not to overtrain and to feed that correct diet profile.
I think more so too, Bryan, it's more about understanding the energy systems and the pathways, how energy is used, what nutrition fuels what energy. You mentioned aerobic and anaerobic. What fuels aerobic energy, what fuels anaerobic energy. We can go briefly into the muscle fibers. Obviously, if you've got an endurance horse, that horse will have a lot more aerobic muscle fibers compared to possibly a thoroughbred or a quarter horse, where the anaerobic muscle fibers are going to be more prominent there.
Yeah, that's right, Pete. And to simplify it straight off the bat, you would look at aerobic, which means with oxygen, creating energy through fat and fiber, whereas anaerobic, which is without oxygen, they're actually burning glucose, sugars, starches, and those glycogen stores that are in the liver and also in the muscles.
Yeah, well said, Bryan. So if we put ourselves as we're the horse owner or we're the horse trainer, what you want to do is, depending on the horse that you have in a competition that you're in, argument's sake, I'll use an endurance horse, 85% of, say, an 80 kilometer competition or even 160 kilometer competition, 85% of that is going to be using aerobic energy. So aerobic energy is normally like at a trot, sort of slow canter, where the horse is, breathing, 15, 16, 17, up to, 20 odd kilometers an hour. So what you want to do is to maximize the performance out of your horse, you want to fuel a lot of its energy through fat and fiber. And then once the fat and fiber gets depleted, at the very end of the competition, that's where you want to be dipping into those glycogen stores, because the glycogen stores, they're very sporadic energy, very explosive, so there's a not lot of it. And then once you do deplete the glycogen, then obviously the horse starts building a lot of lactic acid and it gets tired pretty quickly as well. So you want to get your timing right. You don't want to dip into the glycogen stores too early, because then a horse is going to get the stitch. Might have lactic acid coming out of its ears, God forbid, pardon the pun. But yeah, it's all about the timing and obviously sparing those glycogen stores, as we'll get into this in this podcast.
Yeah, with glycogen, so what is it? So it's the storage form of glucose in the muscles and the liver of the horse. And mainly fuels anaerobic exercise, so without oxygen. Once this is depleted, the horse suffers from fatigue, slow recovery, and risk of injury. So what we're trying to do is you burn your fat and fiber first, which is what Peter just said, and then you dip into those glycogen stores to finish off the race or finish off the event and have sufficient amounts of those glycogen stores to complete it. So that is the key for endurance horses, eventers, even those dressage horses which are doing more stamina work.
Yeah, also harness racing too. We've got a lot of clients from the harness game sort of coming onto the CEN Feed program, and once again, the goal is to get as much fat and fiber into those horses and into those events that are predominantly aerobic energy. So this is a lot of trainers don't realize this. So if you're mainly fueling harness endurance through grains and carbohydrates, the horse is still going to perform. The horse is still going to run, but it's going to get tired a lot sooner. So if you've got if you've got 5 holds, you might go really well up to the 3rd or the 4th hold, but then that lactic acid that's built out throughout those 2, 3, 4th hold, in the 5th one, a horse is going to be struggling. Where if that horse, argument's sake, was on 250, 300 mil of oil or a fat and a high fiber feed, and uses that energy pretty much 3/4 of the event, and only starts using the glycogen at the very end, that person and that horse will have a performance advantage over a horse that was predominantly just on a grain and carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, totally agree there, Pete. With the horses in terms of their glycogen storage, what we found is one thing that some trainers don't understand is how to replenish them and how long it takes for the muscles in the liver to be restored of that glycogen. So in a human, we normally hear the term carbohydrate loading, which is done 24 hours before an event. You hear that marathon runners get all their pastas and everything to bring up their glycogen stores. But in a horse, there is this key difference that it can be up to 72 hours before their glycogen stores are fully replenished. So then therefore that little window of training 3 days out before the event is very important not to dip into those stores, because you could likely go into the event already depleted. And if not trained on fat and fiber, you're really behind the 8 ball in that advantage.
Also, too, when we were researching this podcast, Bryan found a paper there showing that if you've got a horse that's got a lot of muscle, very athletic muscle, they store the glycogen in a muscle. So the more muscle that you have, the more glycogen that the horse can store, then obviously it's got more to use as well. So if you're overtraining or you're overworking a horse, the horse can actually start burning its own muscle, because it's used up all the glycogen, and now it's got to try to get fuel wherever fuel is available, and then actually starts eating into the muscle. So pretty much what Bryan said is that if you don't time your training right, if you don't replenish those glycogen stores, it can have a counterproductive effect.
With the skeletal muscle in a horse, it's about 80% of the glycogen stores, and just due to the size, and the liver has about 20%. So it's really important that you do build really good lean muscle throughout the horse to help get that storage up with the glycogen, because then when they really need it the most, they'll have access to it after they've burnt out all their blood glucose. So when you look at training plans, there's a few dangers of overtraining close to an event, and that can lead to that incomplete muscle glycogen replenishment, and that can lead to early fatigue and performance. And it's not only that, if the horse is feeling a little bit weaker and cannot access that energy, it could be prone to injury, which is what we absolutely want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. So injuries happen when horses get fatigued. Like a lot of people just think, oh, my horse got injured, it's done a tendon or it's done a ligament. And as an example, tendons and ligaments, a lot of them do happen around tight turns, around corners. But what mainly happens is when a horse does get fatigued, it runs out of that glycogen, it starts changing its stride, it starts shortening its stride, and then obviously that's when that injury happens. So adequate training, replenishing glycogen stores, trying to delay the onset of lactic acid through fat and fiber, but more so a balanced diet. That's what we're trying to sort of educate the owner here. It's not just feed everything in one bag and it's going to be 6 kilos and she'll be right. Fortunately, it's not as easy as that.
100%, Peter. And one of the smartest strategies with your sugar and starch intake for performance horses is not to go extremely low sugar and starch, because these are athletes. Muscle really helps that insulin response, and the insulin that unlocks the muscle site for that glucose to go in. Don't treat them as a metabolic horse, which is too low in sugar and starch for the performance horse. The sweet spot they have found is it's around that 15 to 20%, which really goes with our mantra in terms of that nice balance of sugar, starch, fiber, fat, and protein. That creates a really good hindgut environment, which actually helps behavior and a more focused horse. When you look at the traditional grains going above the 30, 40, 50% total sugar and starch in the diet, that's when it starts disrupting the hindgut pH. You get that acidosis and also that increase of ulcers or colic, and it can really affect their temperament. So looking at your overall hard feed being between that 15, 20%, and then when you include your roughage, we've found that this has been the best sweet spot to really trigger the glycogen synthesis. And then also it really helps with any of that metabolic or digestive risk, because these are athletes at the end of the day and they need that full round balance.
Bryan, you mentioned roughage. That's a very key point. When I do the diet consults and when we consult, whether it's a breeding operation, a racing stable or what so forth, the first thing what we'd like to do is get a sample of their roughage and we test it. And look, if you're using a pasture grass, it might be 5 to 7 NSC. If you're using a rye clover mix, it could be up to 20, 25. We've seen them as high as 30% NSC, which is sugar and starch. So if you can imagine, for horses eating 1% of its body weight in hay, and your hay's argument's sake, let's keep it even 30%, it's already consuming a lot of sugar and starch just from the hay. And now if you've got a commercial feed that's at 35% sugar and starch and it's getting 6 kilograms of that, it's not really getting much fiber, it's not really getting much fat, it's getting a lot of sugar and starch. And then basically what happens is it's more than replenishing the glycogen stores, and then you don't want that sugar and starch to get into the hindgut where it's not designed to be, and that's where horses can colic and have different ailments.
Yeah, 100%. Pete, when you look at the all-round basis of the diet and the foundations, the roughage is so important. The other aspect is electrolytes, and that supports muscle function. So salt first, then electrolytes, and they really help the muscle contract and the nerve impulses. So a less efficient muscle will have inefficiencies in burning that glycogen, and that's another piece of this puzzle that we always have to look at. And it's better to slightly over supplement your electrolytes and salt, because the kidneys will filter that per 24 hours, than under supplement where you're going to have incomplete contractions, and you could lead to a lot of muscle issues over time. And that's particularly with the horses that are tying up as well, or prone to tying up, whether that's a genetic factor or environmental overtraining. Having electrolytes and salt in the diet at sufficient amounts is really essential.
From a personal side, obviously, horses have the strain, have the exercise, have the event. The recovery is almost more important than the actual stress factor of the event, because what happens is if you don't give the horse enough recovery, those muscles that have shredded, that have burnt, that have ripped, obviously you need that stress for the muscle to grow. You have to give that horse adequate time off for that muscle to recover, grow, get stronger, and ready for the next event. So from experience, the recovery is, in my opinion, it's almost the most important part, because that's where the muscle grows. The muscle doesn't grow while you're exercising. The muscle grows while you're resting and sleeping, obviously for us humans, but for the horse is when it's recovering from the actual event. And it's a fine line. If you bring it in too soon, obviously it could start burning muscle. You can start ripping muscle and cause an injury. But if you leave them out there for too long, well, you've lost the benefits of the actual, of the grand final event, so-called, that you had that strenuous exercise, the horse has gone well, or it's not, or it's improved fitness, and you want to benefit from it. So it's a very fine line between coming in too late and then bringing it back too soon.
Yeah, it's that 72-hour period that needs to be really looked at in terms of the recovery for the horse between training sessions and then building into the event. And so how do we link fat and this sparing of this glycogen? And it all comes down to training on a fat adapted diet. So the horse can use the fat as a primary energy source before it uses the glycogen stores and sparing them, because when you do spare those glycogen stores, it delays the fatigue. And as we said before, that's better endurance. And then you've got more glycogen available for those higher intensity moments in the competition where they need that speed burst or that energy burst.
Yeah, so feed fat obviously is fuel. What we mean by that is that if a horse hasn't had a fat in its diet or an oil in its diet ever, it can take up to 6 weeks for the gut microbes to start using that fat as energy. So if people think they're going to give it, a cup of CEN Oil and today and then tomorrow the horse is going to start using that whole cup as energy, perish the thought, because it's not going to happen. So you got to give it minimum 6 weeks. If you give too much too soon, the stools can get runny as well. So that's a natural, sort of instinct that a horse has, that if you do give too much, it's, you've gone too fast. So you got to back up, obviously, maybe half the amount or reduce to an amount where the stools are going to be consistent. But these sort of changes, you don't see the results overnight. So patience is a virtue, as they say. It needs to get done slowly. And then when you do add a fat into the diet, let's just say, argument's sake, 100 mil of CEN Oil is the equivalent of about 300 to 350 grams of oats or possibly corn. What you want to do is you're actually getting a very energy dense nutrition there with the fat. So you may want to back up some of the grains as well to make sure that your horse isn't doing backflips. It's just balancing the actual energy that you're giving to the work that the horse is doing.
Yeah, the horse's small intestines can really digest it nicely at those amounts. You're not overdoing it so it reaches the hindgut. You're not underdoing it so you're not sparing the glycogen. And it's that key introduction, as Pete said, over time throughout that training. And those calories are a cool source of calories that don't upset their behavior like a grain does. So you're getting a really good benefit of energy without that spike of insulin. And yeah, I think as we look at the landscape these days, if you're not feeding a fat in the diet, it is a definite disadvantage in the landscape that we're seeing with many trainers.
Look, a lot of companies we've noticed recently are putting a lot of oil in their feeds, and whether it's a pelleted feed or it's a combination of whatever. We're one of the only companies in Australia, if not the world, that don't actually put an oil through our pellet, because when you heat a pellet, whether it's 80 degrees, 90 degrees, or over 100 degrees, any oil you put into that pellet with heat will oxidize. And then obviously with oxidized oil, the horse consumes it, will release free radicals. And now the horse's, internal organisms have to clean up that oxidization, the free radicals and everything like that. So we choose not to put it in there. We use a steam pressing technology, which is very natural. And we try to educate our customers to add the oil into the pellet fresh, because that's when you get pretty much the freshness of it, and you do get all the omega-3 benefits and everything else.
Yeah, definitely. When you look at how fragile omega-3 is and how vital it is in the recovery of the horse, that's what we want viable in what we feed our horses. And you cannot get it viable within a pellet that's heated, because the omega-3 needs to be protected from light, oxygen, or heat. And adding it fresh, and there's a reason why we do something in our diets each day, is to get that viability. And when you look at how successful CEN Oil has been over the past decade, it really goes to show that it's really helping the horse, particularly the performance horse, compared to those traditional cooking oils that we once saw being fed a lot when we first got in the industry. And when they've done studies on the high omega-6 to the high omega-3 oils, our type of oil really promotes better red cell production and antioxidant activity within the horse. And this all helps recovery and the horse to thrive in their performance. And when you look at nature, grass has omega-3 or higher omega-3 than omega-6. We're just looking at what really goes well with the horse's physiology and then transferring that to this domesticated performance setting and getting the results at the end of the day.
Bryan, it's very well summarized. I'd like to say that with replenishing glycogen stores, it's very easy to do, because it's very easy. A lot of feeds, have grain byproducts. Our products got sugar and starch around about 14-15%. So if you give it 72 hours, it's very easy to replenish the glycogen stores. What you do want to do, especially when you bring a horse in after a spell and you're going to get it into easy training, light work, majority of that trot, canter, slow canter work, doesn't matter what what event or what discipline your horse is in, a horse can manage off fat and fiber basically in a diet with adequate hay. even up to moderate work. So if you start loading that horse up on too much carbohydrates for light work, you're risking that high in gut acidosis. It's unwarranted sugar and starch that doesn't need to fuel that type of light work. So if you look at the overall picture, depending how long it's going to be in light work, moderate work, and heavy work, it's almost like you got to judge what fuel source you need for that particular energy work, and then whether it's aerobic energy, anaerobic energy. How long trot do you do? How long canter do you do? What's the duration of the work? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 55 minutes? So it's better to be safe than sorry, and trying to do it off of fat and fiber first. And as you increase the speed, as you increase the duration, then you can start dipping into those starchy, sugary feeds.
Yeah, and it all comes down to your chosen discipline and how your horse is always treated as an individual, because some are blessed with great genetics and want to be, or were born to be athletes, and some just need that extra hand. But if you go on these sparing glycogen principles with a fat added to the diet, it is definitely an advantage. And when 1 or 2% improvement in performance means a lot in many disciplines, we think it's very vital.
Yeah, and it's not like, a diet high in fat, high in fiber is actually going to, grow another leg on a horse. You're just optimizing the performance in that horse. And I like to give an analogy. If you've got a sports car and, it's designed to run on, 98 octane fuel, if you're going to give it ethanol 85, the sports car will still drive. It's still going to be pretty fast, but it's not going to be at optimum performance like all the other cars, that are running on 98. So you want to fuel that horse pretty much on its optimum fuel source, and you don't want to be putting any lead weights behind it.
Particularly lead weights that could lead to chronic inflammation, and that's what you see with a high omega-6 oil on a daily basis. You're just running the risk that a higher omega-6 than omega-3 oil will just help promote more inflammatory pathways. We do need inflammation to build muscle, but we need a controlled amount and not systemic inflammation over time. And that goes hand in hand with recovery when you choose an oil that really helps the immune system as well. And when you look at the oils that are high in omega-3 that helps control that inflammation naturally and gives those anti-inflammatory properties, you're going to have a horse that, as it gets later on in life, you want to try and avoid that joint stiffness and those arthritic changes that can occur, and really look after them throughout their performing years. And when you look at how a young horse is brought up as well, getting them on this type of diet really early, not only one helps their structure, but also metabolically, they're going to be a better horse later on with less chances of that insulin resistance that we're seeing a lot of.
And when you are looking into oils, make sure it's from a reputable manufacturer like CEN, obviously HACCP certification, GMP certification. Make sure the product is certified, because feeding a rancid oil can have pretty bad effects like feeding an omega-6 oil. A lot of these omega-6 oils, the cooking oils, they're not made naturally. They're chemically extracted, whether it's using hexane or so forth. There's a lot of, raw linseed oils on the market as well, and a raw linseed oil is not the same as a first cold press flaxseed oil. And the only way you know that you're getting a proper certified oil is by the company being certified, the company getting audited yearly through the manufacturing practices to know exactly that the money that you're spending is exactly what you're getting for that money.
Yeah, that's very well said, Peter. And to really summarize this in the most simple terms, when you have a good fat and fiber source in the diet, and that is with a foundation of a grassy hay as roughage, which is low sugar, low starch, you can build upon this for each individual performance horse. And at CEN, we're here to help, and we offer a free diet consult service, which we're doing over 100 a month, which is really popular to help horse owners understand their horse individually, because you can run them through a program or ask your friend what they're feeding, but to really look and zone in with your particular horse in their particular environment and what makes them tick or not tick in terms of their response to training or their response to a feed, it is a very valuable exercise to go through. And with the results and feedback that CEN has had over the past 11 years, I think we're doing something right, Pete.
Bryan, is that like a phone a friend on the quiz shows on TV? Every friend's got an opinion.
Some of the trainers have a friend called Bryan that likes to check on what's going on, and particularly blood results as well. So if you've got any questions regarding blood results in horses, I am still at the coalface in terms of analysing and looking at blood test results and helping horse owners not get. It's not so being tricked by vets, because many vets are really onto it with bloods, but getting that second opinion, because I did interview Dr. Mike Tomlinson, one of the FEI vets, and he admitted that one of their parts in their veterinary education was blood tests, but they did blood tests and nutrition on all animals, not just horses. They're doing it on snakes, birds. So getting that real zeroed down expertise in terms of looking at blood test results and not overcomplicating the result coming out. I've deep dived this in previous podcasts that you'll be able to search for as well. So at CEN, we've got a lot of differences to other companies where we're looking at the whole holistic makeup of the horse, not just the nutrition, but also the training that goes on. And we're just here to help simplify a lot of the noise that's in the industry.
Look, it can be daunting try to balance a diet on yourself, as Bryan was saying. And like through the consults, we do get a lot of people, when they sort of, be honest with us that, their friends are telling them this, their family's telling them that, granddad did this, uncle did that. And it's science has changed. And, I like to give an example that I gave previously, that at this year's Olympics, the guy that came last would have won the gold medal 20 years ago. So that's how much training has improved, nutrition has improved, just general science has improved. So if you're not utilizing the latest science to your advantage, you're going to get left behind. In a thoroughbred game, we know with our clients, there's sports scientists sort of jumping out of trees now that are working with these cutting edge trainers. They're looking at all the data, they're doing lactates, recovery. So it is becoming a science-based industry. And I think the horse industry sort of got left behind with nutrition and science. And we're trying to bring that to the forefront with the education that we're doing through this podcast itself. It's easier when you've got someone there guiding you. And, even if you don't have a grassy hay, as Bryan mentioned, we can still make it work with a barley hay, or if you've got a rye, or if you've got prime lucerne. There's different things we need to push and pull to make it work. But, just because you don't have a hay that we recommend does not mean that we cannot balance a diet. And that's where we highly recommend that you book in diet consults. You'll get myself, obviously Bryan, or the girls, depending when we're available. We can take your hand and sort of lead you through it. There's no silly question, and we encourage every question under the roof to be asked. The more questions you ask, the more educated and empowered you become, and then it's easier to make that decision for your horse once you have that knowledge with you.
We're definitely in the box seat, Pete, with our solutions, because we're not overcomplicating and not having 20 bags that are all different colours of the rainbow, which we see time and time again.
It's a good one, Bryan. I like that one.
And what we are finding is just the development of artificial intelligence, or AI. It's probably a necessary evil that we're going down, and in health-wise for humans as well, with everything that they can do in a shorter amount of time, even with stem cells, it's all going to be developed. And even in the horse industry, if it's not embraced, particularly with the sports science, with heart rates, and in that high performance arena, I think can be utilized in all disciplines, not just racing. It's actually better management for the horse, and the horse actually is in a better health way than they were 20 years ago, as we can see, because the research does not stop. And if we do rest on the research, then I think we're not progressing, because even take ulcers, for example, they rewrote the handbook on that a couple of years ago. So we're not referring to a journal 15 years ago. They've concised that, and it's actually 2 disease states. And that's just one example of the progression, including the hindgut as well, with the microbiome and how that affects behavior. We weren't talking about this 20 years ago. And the best thing about what the times we're living on today is we can get things done quicker, we can get things done with data, so then the horse benefits at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise in industry and a lot of smoke, and what we're trying to get is, pretty much the latest science, latest research, and the root cause of the problems that some of our customers may be having. Because if you could get down to the root cause, it's a lot easier to find a solution. And, whether you're in sort of performance, whether you've got an older hack, it's all about balance. You got to get the balance right. As Bryan said, the protein, fat, fiber, even your hay, whether it's a sugary hay or it's not. The free diet service is very well adapted. A lot of people, do get the answers that they're looking for. If you've also liked this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. I think we're up to 118.
Yeah.
Bryan's goal is 150 now, so hopefully that happens in 24 hours.
we've been having great feedback in terms of, we've got a lot of adjustments as well, giving it to their clients to listen to when they travel to and from. And I think when you introduce it to someone, they start listening to a few other topics that we've gone over, and they just go, "Oh, this is unbelievable that you've got this amount of content." And I've even got one new client who said, "What you said in the podcast is happening before my eyes with my horse in the last 2 to 3 weeks in real life. What the changes you'll see, the transition that you go through." And I think that's why Peter and I do this, because we're so passionate about horse health and wanting to find the right answers, but the simple answer to all aspects, including the nutrition and training.
Well, I think having both founders and both owners hands-on in the business, looking at all the literature, all the data, feedback from hundreds, if not thousands, of clients that we've got, feedback, whether it's good feedback or bad feedback, we can pivot and adapt and share any latest information that we're getting. And end of the day, the owner, the consumer is actually going to benefit, because this is real life, up to date information that we're sharing.
Yeah, 100%, Pete. So to summarize this into a couple of sentences, let's use fat as the advantage in your diet to help spare those glycogen stores, because then with long, slow distance work, you will build their aerobic capacity, which will spare the glycogen being used, using fat and fiber as the main fuel source to then have access to that glycogen stores that haven't been tapped for that explosive energy when required during the race or the performance. Anything else, Pete?
No, Bryan, I think you've summarised it.
So we'll have another podcast to you guys really soon, as it's not gin o'clock because I am not drinking alcohol at the moment.
Well, Bryan, when you do, and when we go to the Tom Quilty, I'm going to get you a double Long Island iced tea. There'll be no room for the Coke in a double.
That's true. We've had a few of those in our time, but yeah, we're looking forward to heading down to Tasmania to catch up with a lot of our endurance clients, and we believe that's some of the forefront of performance down there, because over 160 kilometres, you've got nowhere to hide, and it's really good that Peter and I jump on the coalface down there just to see how the landscape is, and that's what we do. We get all the feedback and we try and innovate and make horse owners' lives a lot more simple with the information that we're giving out.
That's well summarised, Bryan. We'll catch everyone again next week.
Thanks, guys.